Soren had never believed in omens. He was a scholar, a man of parchment and ink, trained to trust what could be seen and measured and recorded in neat columns on vellum. But when the raiders came screaming over the hill with axes raised and fire spilling from their torches, he understood for the first time that the world was full of things that could not be explained, only survived. They burned his lord's hall to ashes. They slaughtered the guards who tried to fight. They took everything that glittered and left everything that bled. And when they found Soren hiding in the library, pressed between shelves of scrolls he had spent 7 years translating, they did not kill him. They looked at his soft hands and his ink-stained fingers and his face that had never known a day of hard labor, and they laughed. "A scribe," one of them said, grabbing him by the hair and yanking his head back. "The Jarl will want this one. We need someone to count our gold who can actually read." They threw him over a horse like a sack of grain, and Soren watched his home disappear into the smoke. That was 3 weeks ago. Now he was a stranger among raiders, a soft southern scholar trapped in a northern war camp that stretched along the banks of a river he did not know the name of. He had learned to keep his head down, to speak only when spoken to eat the scraps they threw him and sleep in the corner they assigned him. He had learned to translate their crude runes into the southern tongue for ransom letters, to count their silver and tally their dead, to make himself useful enough that no one thought to slit his throat for sport. But he had not learned to stop feeling their eyes on him. There were always eyes. The raiders looked at him with contempt or curiosity, or, worst of all, hunger. Some of them whispered about him when they thought he could not hear, called him the Jarl's pet, the little southern whore, the pretty thing with the golden hair. Others were bolder, grabbing at him when they passed, laughing when he flinched. Jarl Ivar the Loud, their leader, was the worst of them. He was a massive man with a red beard that reached his belt, and a belly that strained his leather armor, and he had made it clear from the first night that Soren's place in the camp was precarious at best. "You belong to me now, scribe," Ivar had said, gripping Soren's chin with thick, dirty fingers. "You speak when I tell you to speak. You breathe when I tell you to breathe, and if I decide I want something else from you, you will give it." He had laughed then, a wet, ugly sound, and shoved Soren back into the mud. But Ivar had not touched him. Not yet, because there was something, or someone, that made even the Jarl hesitate. The first night in the camp, Soren had noticed him, a figure sitting apart from the others, at the very edge of the firelight where the shadows pooled like water. He was massive, not fat like Ivar, but built of lean muscle and sinew, his shoulders broad enough to block out the stars behind him. His face was covered in tattoos that twisted across his cheeks and forehead and disappeared into the collar of his worn leather tunic, patterns that Soren recognized from his studies as the funeral markings of a northern tribe that had been wiped out decades ago. His hair was dark and hung in matted ropes past his shoulders, and in his lap rested an axe that looked like it had killed more men than Soren had ever met. But it was his eyes that held Soren frozen. Even from across the camp, through the smoke and the flickering flames and the press of bodies, Soren could see that they were pale, so pale they looked almost white, like winter sky before a storm, and those eyes were looking directly at him, not glancing, not wandering, fixed, intent, as if Soren were the only thing in the entire camp worth seeing. Soren had looked away first, his heart pounding, his skin prickling with a fear that was different from the fear he felt around Ivar. This fear was quieter, stranger, a thread of ice running down his spine that did not make him want to run. It made him want to stay perfectly still and wait to see what happened next. Nothing happened. The figure did not move, did not speak, did not approach. He simply sat there, watching, until the fire burned low and the raiders drifted off to their tents, and then he stood and disappeared into the darkness as if he had never been there at all. The next night, it was the same. Soren sat in his corner, eating his cold porridge, and the pale-eyed stranger sat at the edge of the firelight watching. The night after that, the same, and the night after that. Soren began to notice things about him. He never spoke, not to the other raiders, not to Ivar, not to anyone. When the warriors laughed and sang, he sat in silence. When they fought and wrestled, he stood apart. When they ate, he ate alone, always facing outward, always watching. The others gave him a wide berth. They did not look at him if they could help it. They did not sit beside him, did not clap him on the shoulder, did not invite him to join their games. Once, Soren saw a young warrior stumble too close to the stranger's spot by accident, and the look of terror that flashed across the young man's face was so raw that Soren almost felt sorry for him. The stranger had not moved, had not lifted his axe, had not even blinked, but the young warrior had scrambled backward as if he had seen death itself. Soren asked about him once quietly to a thrall woman who sometimes brought him food. "Who is he?" She had crossed herself, an old southern gesture that looked strange on her weathered northern face, and whispered, "That is Rune. They call him the Shadow. He does not speak. Some say he cannot. Some say he will not. Some say he sold his voice to the gods in exchange for the power to kill without mercy." She had glanced over her shoulder as if afraid he might be listening. "Do not go near him, Southerner. He is not like us. He is not like anyone. He was found in the ruins of a village that had been dead for 50 years, and he was the only living thing among the bones. Jarl Ivar keeps him because he is the most dangerous weapon we have, but even Ivar is afraid of him." Soren had nodded, thanked her, and resolved to stay far away from the pale-eyed stranger. But that night, as he sat in his corner, he found himself looking for those eyes in the darkness. And when he found them, pale, unblinking, fixed on him with that impossible intensity, he did not look away. For the first time, he held the gaze. 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. And then, slowly, the stranger inclined his head, a tiny movement barely perceptible, and Soren felt something shift in his chest. It was not fear. It was not curiosity. It was something else entirely, something he had no name for. He looked away first, but only because his heart was beating too fast and his face was too hot, and he did not understand what was happening to him. The days blurred into a rhythm. March, camp, count, right, sleep. March, camp, count, right, sleep. The raiders pushed south, burning villages and taking what they could carry. And Soren translated ransom demands and tallied loot and tried not to think about the eyes that followed him everywhere. Because Rune followed him. Not closely, never close enough to touch, but always there, at the edge of the camp, at the back of the column, in the shadows of the tents. When Soren woke in the night, shivering from cold or fear, he would sometimes see a figure standing a dozen paces away, facing outward, guarding, not the camp, but him. Soren told himself it was coincidence. He told himself Rune was just watching for enemies, just doing his duty, just existing in the same space at the same time. But he knew it was not true. Rune was watching him, and Soren was beginning to watch back. He learned to read Rune's silences. The way he held his axe told Soren whether he was alert or at ease. The angle of his head told Soren whether he was listening to the camp or listening to something else, something only he could hear. The slight tension in his jaw told Soren when he was angry, though Soren never knew at what. And his eyes, those pale, impossible eyes, told Soren nothing and everything. They were not cruel. That was what Soren came to understand first. They were not hungry or calculating or cold. They were simply watching, as if Rune was trying to memorize him. As if Soren were a language Rune was learning, one look at a time. The change came slowly, so slowly that Soren almost did not notice it. The other raiders began to leave him alone. Not all of them. Ivar still sneered at him, and some of the younger warriors still grabbed at him when they thought no one was looking. But the worst of it stopped. The casual cruelty, the casual hands, the casual threats. Soren did not understand why until one night, when he saw a raider named Gunnar, a brute who had taken special pleasure in knocking Soren's food from his hands, approach him with a sneer and a raised fist. Before Gunnar could swing, a shadow fell over them both. Rune had appeared from nowhere, as he always did, silent as smoke. He did not draw his axe. He did not move at all. He simply stood there, a head taller than Gunnar, his pale eyes fixed on the raider's face with an expression that made Gunnar go white. "I wasn't going to hurt him," Gunnar stammered, backing away. I was just... Rune did not respond. He did not need to. Gunnar turned and fled, and the other raiders who had been watching suddenly found urgent business elsewhere. Rune stood for a moment longer, his gaze sweeping the camp, and then he looked down at Soren, really looked. for the first time so close that Soren could see the individual lines of the tattoos on his face, the small scar that split his upper lip, the way his pale eyes caught the firelight and held it. Then he turned and walked back to his spot at the edge of the darkness. Soren's heart was pounding, his hands were shaking, but he was not afraid. For the first time since he had been captured, he was not afraid. He was something else. He was curious, he was grateful, and he was desperately, inexplicably drawn to the silent warrior who had become his shadow. That night, Soren did something foolish. He waited until the camp was quiet, until the fires had burned low and the snores of the raiders echoed through the tents, and then he stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight. Rune was there, sitting against a fallen log, his axe across his knees. His pale eyes found Soren immediately, tracking him as he approached. Soren stopped a few feet away, close enough to see the rise and fall of Rune's chest, close enough to smell the leather and pine and old iron that clung to him. "I know you are watching me," Soren said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have known it since the first night. I do not understand why. I do not understand anything about you, but I am not afraid of you anymore." Rune did not move, did not speak, but something in his eyes shifted, a softening perhaps, or a recognition. Soren took another step closer, close enough now that he could have reached out and touched the tattoos on Rune's face. "I want to know your name," Soren said. "I know they call you Rune, but that is not a name. That is a title. That is a wall. I want to know who you are underneath." For a long moment, Rune was still. Then slowly, he reached up and touched his own throat, a gesture that Soren had seen before in the drawings of northern shamans. It meant silence. It meant a vow. It meant something given that could never be taken back. "You cannot speak," Soren said, and it was not a question. Rune inclined his head. "But you understand me," Soren continued. "You understand every word I am saying." Another incline of the head. Soren's heart ached. He thought of what the thrall woman had said, found in the ruins of a dead village, the only living thing among the bones. He thought of the way the other raiders flinched from Rune, the way even Ivar looked at him with a mixture of greed and fear. He thought of the eyes that had followed him for weeks, not with hunger or malice, but with something that looked, impossibly, like longing. "You are lonely," Soren said softly. "You are the loneliest person I have ever seen." Rune's jaw tightened. His pale eyes glistened, not with tears exactly, but with something close. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small object, holding it out to Soren. It was a carved stone, small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, etched with runes that Soren recognized as a name. Not a title, a name that had been given to someone once before everything was taken away. "This is your name," Soren said, tracing the runes with his fingertip. "This is who you were before." Rune nodded, and then slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and took Soren's hand, not gripping it, not holding it captive, but simply placing his scarred fingers over Soren's pale ones. The touch was light, almost tentative, as if Rune was not sure he was allowed. Soren's breath caught. The hand was warm, warmer than he had expected, warmer than the cold night air should have allowed. And Rune was looking at him with those pale eyes, and for the first time Soren understood. He was not being watched like prey. He was being watched like someone precious, someone worth protecting, someone worth wanting. "I will not run from you," Soren said, and he meant it. "I have been running my whole life, from my lord, from my duties, from the person I was supposed to become. But I am tired of running. I am tired of being afraid. If you are offering me something, I do not know what it is, but if you are offering, I accept." Rune's hand tightened around his, and he pulled Soren closer, not roughly, but with a desperate gentleness, as if he had been waiting for this moment for years. They sat together in the darkness, Soren's back against Rune's chest, Rune's arms around Soren's waist, and neither of them spoke. They did not need to. For the first time in weeks, Soren slept without dreaming of fire, and when he woke at dawn, Rune was still there, still watching, and something had changed between them that could never be undone. The next weeks were a careful, silent courtship. Rune could not speak, so he spoke with actions. He left food beside Soren's sleeping place, better food than the scraps Soren usually received, fresh bread and dried meat, and once, impossibly, a handful of summer berries that must have been carried from far away. He mended Soren's torn cloak with stitches so fine that Soren would not have believed a warrior's hands capable of them. He stood between Soren and anyone who looked at him wrong, not with aggression, but with presence, a silent wall of muscle and menace that said without words, "This one is mine." And Soren, who had never been courted by anyone, who had spent his life hidden in libraries and translating dead languages, found himself falling. It was not a dramatic fall, it was slow, like snow settling on a frozen river, layer by layer until the ice was thick enough to walk on. He learned to read Rune's moods from the set of his shoulders. He learned to make Rune laugh, a silent, shaking thing that was more expression than sound, his pale eyes crinkling at the corners and his chest trembling with suppressed mirth. He learned that Rune could write after a fashion, scratching runes in the dirt with a stick, and they began to have conversations that way, short, halting, but real. "Why me?" Soren wrote one night, tracing the runes in the soil between them. Rune looked at the words for a long time. Then he smoothed the dirt with his palm and wrote back, "You look at me like I'm human." Soren's throat tightened. "You are human," he wrote. "You are the most human person I have ever met." Rune's hand hovered over the dirt, and then he wrote, "They say I am cursed. Everyone who loves me dies." Soren looked up at him into those pale eyes that had followed him through darkness and danger and silence. "Then I will not love you," he wrote. Rune's expression flickered, confusion perhaps or hurt, but Soren was not finished. He smoothed the dirt and wrote again, "I will love you anyway, and I will not die." Rune stared at the words, his hand trembled, and then, for the first time since Soren had known him, he made a sound, a small, broken noise, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. He reached out and pulled Soren into his arms, held him so tightly that Soren could barely breathe, and buried his face in Soren's hair. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, and when they finally pulled apart, Rune took Soren's hand and pressed it to his chest, over his heart so Soren could feel it beating, fast and strong and alive. "For you," Rune wrote in the dirt with one hand, still holding Soren's hand to his heart with the other. "This beats for you." The storm came without warning. Soren had seen northern storms before, had felt the wind rip through the camp and the rain turn the ground to mud, but this was different. This was a blizzard, a wall of white that descended on them as they marched through a narrow valley between two frozen rivers. One moment, the sky was clear and cold. The next, the world vanished into screaming wind and stinging ice. Jarl Ivar shouted orders that were swallowed by the gale. The raiders stumbled and fell, losing sight of each other, losing their way. Soren clung to the pack horse, his fingers numb, his face so cold he could no longer feel his nose. Then the ice cracked beneath him. The river had not been as frozen as they thought. Soren fell through the ice with a scream that was cut off by the shock of cold, cold so intense that it felt like fire, like being burned alive from the inside out. The current grabbed him, pulled him under, and the world became darkness and cold and the terrible weight of water filling his lungs. He fought, he clawed, he tried to swim, but he did not know which way was up, and his limbs were already going numb, and he thought, "This is it. This is how I die, drowned in a frozen river in a land I never wanted to see." Then something grabbed him, not the current, not the ice. Something strong, impossibly strong, wrapped around his chest and hauled him upward. He broke the surface, gasping, choking, vomiting water, and found himself pressed against the body that was warm despite the cold, warmer than it had any right to be. Rune. Rune had jumped in after him. Rune had pulled him from the river and was now carrying him through the blizzard, one arm locked around Soren's chest, his massive body shielding Soren from the worst of the wind. Soren tried to speak, tried to thank him, but his teeth were chattering too hard and his lips were too blue, and all he could do was hold on. Rune found a cave, a shallow overhang in the rock face, just deep enough to block the wind. He laid Soren on the cold stone and stripped off both their wet clothes with efficient, desperate movements. Then he pulled Soren against his bare chest, wrapped his arms and legs around him, and covered them both with the only dry thing he had, his own cloak, which he had somehow kept dry by holding it above his head as he swam. "Sea, cold," Soren managed, his voice a shuddering whisper. Rune held him tighter. His body was like a furnace, heat radiating from his skin in waves that slowly began to Thorin's frozen limbs. He rubbed Soren's arms, his back, his legs, rough, vigorous motions that brought blood rushing back to numb flesh. And all the while, his pale eyes never left Soren's face, watching for signs of warmth, of consciousness, of life. Soren did not know how long they stayed like that. Hours, perhaps. The storm howled outside the cave, and the wind screamed, and the cold tried to creep back in every time Rune's grip loosened. But Rune did not let go. He held Soren as if he were the most precious thing in the world, as if letting go would mean losing him forever. And Soren held back, his arms wrapped around Rune's neck, his face buried in the crook of Rune's shoulder. When the storm finally passed and the first gray light of dawn crept into the cave, Soren was warm. He was alive. And Rune was still watching him, those pale eyes soft now, almost tender. Soren reached up and touched Rune's face, tracing the lines of his tattoos, the curve of his jaw, the place where his lips pressed together in a permanent line of silence. "You saved my life," Soren whispered. Rune inclined his head. "Why?" Soren asked, though he already knew the answer. Rune took Soren's hand and pressed it to his chest again, over his heart, still beating, still strong. "You know why," his eyes said. "You have always known." Soren kissed him. It was his first kiss. He had never wanted anyone before, had never let anyone close enough to try, and it was clumsy and cold and perfect. Rune's lips were warm against his. Rune's arms tightened around him, and for a long suspended moment, there was no storm, no raiders, no curse, no fear. There was only this. Only them. When they finally broke apart, Rune's pale eyes were bright with something that looked like tears. He reached for a flat stone on the cave floor and scratched runes into it with a shard of flint. When he handed it to Soren, the message was simple. Stay. Soren looked at the word, then at the man who had followed him with his eyes for weeks, who had fed him and protected him and jumped into an icy river to save him. "I stayed the first time you looked at me," Soren said. "I just did not know it yet." He kissed Rune again, softer this time, and when they finally emerged from the cave into the pale morning light, hand in hand the world was new. They found the raiders 2 miles down the river, huddled around a makeshift camp, counting their dead. The blizzard had claimed 4 of them, including Gunnar, who had been found frozen against a tree with his eyes still open. Jarl Ivar was alive, though his red beard was crusted with ice and his face was purple with cold. When he saw Soren and Rune approaching, Soren wrapped in Rune's cloak, Rune bare-chested and carrying his axe, his eyes widened. "You survived," Ivar said, his voice hoarse. "The Southerner survived the river." He looked at Rune and something like understanding passed over his face. "You jumped in after him. You saved him." Rune did not respond. He did not need to. His arm was around Soren's waist, and Soren was leaning into him, and the message was clear to everyone who looked. "He is yours," Ivar said. It was not a question. Rune inclined his head. Ivar laughed, a short, bitter sound. "The cursed one finally found something worth living for. I did not think I would live to see it." He spat on the ground. "Keep him then. He is useless to me now anyway. No one will pay ransom for a scribe who reeks of river water and belongs to a ghost." Soren should have been relieved. He should have thanked his gods and walked away. But something in him had changed, hardened, grown sharp edges during his weeks among the raiders. "I do not belong to him," Soren said, his voice steady. "I belong with him. There is a difference." Ivar's eyes narrowed, but before he could speak, Kara appeared, the old thrall woman who had first told Soren about Rune's past. She hobbled forward, leaning on a gnarled staff, and looked at Soren with eyes that seemed to see through his skin and into his soul. "The curse," she said. "You know of it." "I know," Soren said. "Everyone who loves him dies." "And you are not afraid?" Soren looked at Rune, at his pale eyes, his tattooed face, his silent mouth that had never spoken a word but had said more to Soren than any man's voice ever could. "I have been afraid my whole life," Soren said. "I am tired of being afraid. If loving him means dying, then I will die. But I do not think I will. I think the curse was waiting for someone who was not afraid, someone who chose him, someone who looked at him and saw not a monster, not a weapon, not a ghost, but a man." Kara was silent for a long moment. Then she smiled, a gapped, toothless smile, and reached out to touch Soren's forehead with her staff. "The curse is broken," she said. "It broke the moment you stopped running from him." She turned to Ivar. "The Southerner is free." So is the shadow. You will not touch either of them again, or the gods will answer." Ivar glared, but he did not argue. Even he could not ignore the word of a seer, especially one who had never been wrong. "Go then," he said, waving a thick hand. "Go to your cave and your cursed love and freeze to death for all I care. We march north at dawn. Do not follow." Soren did not need to be told twice. He took Rune's hand, and they walked away from the camp. Away from the raiders, away from everything that had hurt him. They walked south toward the coast, toward the village where Rune had been born, toward a future that Soren had never dared to imagine. They walked in silence, because Rune could not speak, and Soren did not need him to. And when they stopped that night to make camp, Rune pulled Soren into his arms and held him, and Soren felt those pale eyes on his face, still watching, still following, but softer now, softer than they had ever been. "I love you," Soren said, because it was true, because it was the only thing left to say. Rune's arms tightened, Rune's lips pressed against his forehead, and Rune's eyes, those impossible, beautiful, pale eyes, said everything else. They reached the coast 3 days later. The village was small, a cluster of stone and turf houses huddled against the cliffs, with fishing boats pulled up on the shore and smoke rising from a single chimney. Rune stopped at the edge of the village, his hand tightening around Soren's. His pale eyes were distant, haunted, as if he was seeing ghosts instead of buildings. "This is where you were found," Soren said softly, "in the ruins." Rune nodded. "Do you want to go in?" Rune was still for a long moment. Then he shook his head. He pulled out the carved stone, the one with his true name, and pressed it into Soren's hand. Then he pointed to himself, then to Soren, then to the horizon. "You are my home now," the gesture said. "I do not need to go back, I only need to go forward, with you." Soren's eyes burned with tears. He clutched the stone to his chest and pulled Rune into a kiss, deep and slow and full of all the words Rune could not say. When they finally broke apart, Rune was smiling, not the silent, shaking almost smile Soren had seen before, but a real smile, wide and bright and full of teeth. It transformed his face, made him look young and alive and impossibly beautiful. "I want to hear your voice," Soren said, cupping Rune's face in his hands. "I do not care if it is broken. I do not care if it is only one word. I want to hear you say my name." Rune's smile faded into concentration. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. His throat worked, muscles straining, as if he were trying to move a mountain with sheer will. And then so softly that Soren almost missed it, he spoke. So, Soren." The voice was rough, a rusted thing that sounded like it had not been used in decades, but it was real, it was his, and it was saying Soren's name. Soren wept. He wept and laughed and kissed Rune and kissed him again, and when they finally walked into the village together hand in hand, the few people who lived there came out to stare. An old man with a missing ear approached them, squinting at Rune's tattoos. Is that the shadow?" he asked. "I am Soren," Soren said, stepping forward. "And this is not the shadow, this is the man you left in the ruins. His name is—" He stopped because he realized he'd not know how to pronounce it. He held up the carved stone instead. The old man's face went pale. "That name has not been spoken in 50 years, he whispered. "We thought he was dead. We thought the whole village was dead." "He is not dead," Soren said. "He is here, and he is mine." The old man looked at Rune, at the way Rune held Soren's hand, at the way his pale eyes watched the young southerner with an intensity that could only be love. "Then take him," the old man said. "Take him and go. He has suffered enough in this place. Let him find peace somewhere else." They did not stay. They walked through the village and out the other side, following a path that led up into the hills, away from the sea, away from the past. They walked until the sun set and the stars came out, and then they found a sheltered spot among the rocks and made a bed of moss and bracken. Rune lay on his back, looking up at the sky, and Soren lay beside him with his head on Rune's chest, listening to the heartbeat that beat for him. "You spoke today," Soren said. "You said my name." Rune's chest rumbled with silent laughter. He took Soren's hand and pressed it to his lips, kissing each fingertip one by one. Then he traced a word on Soren's palm with his thumb. "More." "More what?" Soren asked. Rune sat up, pulling Soren with him. He took Soren's face in his hands and looked into his eyes. those pale, beautiful eyes that had followed Soren through darkness and cold and fear. And then, slowly, carefully, as if each syllable cost him something he could never get back, he spoke again. "Stay. With me." Soren's heart swelled so full he thought it might burst. "Always," he said, "I will always stay." Rune kissed him, and the stars wheeled overhead. And somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. Not a warning, but a blessing. The curse was broken. The stranger was no longer a stranger, and the eyes that had followed him had finally found their home.